I would like to begin by having you close your eyes and listen quietly to the words of one of John Sitter's favorite poems, God's Grandeur, by Gerard Manley Hopkins. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men, then, now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, have trod, have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness, deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning, at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and bright wings. The dialectic give and take in this poem can be seen as a symbol of the intellectual passions that keep John Sitter as lively and imaginative, creative and engaged today as he was some years ago when he first started out. This dialectic can be seen in the poem's move between misery and hope. On the one hand, there is reality as apocalypse in a world that has been permanently seared, bleared, and smeared with products of human industry. On the other hand, nature offers us a helping hand and lends hope to our contemplation of the future in the changing of the seasons, the passing of the hours, the days, and the years. Nature seems to watch over us like a warm and generous mother. Perhaps it was the desire to reflect more on the role of the divine in human and natural affairs that first brought John Sitter to us from an illustrious career at another university some 10 years ago. Perhaps it was his desire to speak more of value and ethics, a particular strength of the Notre Dame curriculum with its foundation in philosophy and theology. For whatever reason, we are lucky he is here. One of the reasons we are lucky he is here lies in his ability and desire to span the gap between science and the humanities on behalf of an urgent social issue, and that is the environment. In a powerful recent article, John Sitter took on the topic of academic habits of laziness, vanity, and minutiae, and called for embracing large topics of public concern. He quotes Samuel Johnson's essay on the character and duty of an academic from the late 18th century, where Johnson describes the academic as a man supported at the public cost and dignified with public honors, that he may attain and impart wisdom. He is maintained by the public that he may study at leisure. He is dignified with honors that he may teach with weight. The great duty, therefore, of an academic is diligence of inquiry and liberality of communication. John fills that bill with his continuous excellence in scholarly writing. He is a specialist in 18th century poetry and a teacher of poetry, satire, and fiction from the Renaissance to the present. He is the author of 4 books and editor of 3 more. His most recent title from 2011 is The Cambridge Introduction to 18th Century Poetry, and he is currently working on another book on a study of literature and the imagination of posterity. Samuel Johnson wrote about the academic that Of him that is appointed to teach, the first business is to learn. The academic is the depositary of the public faith, and it is required of him that to be always able to prove what he asserts, to give an account of his hope, and to display his opinion with such evidence as every species of argument admits. Well, John fills that bill to the hilt, and he is an inspiration to all of us. As the chair of the English department, Valerie Sayers wrote in her letter of nomination, John's decision to focus on sustainability studies in his 5th decade of teaching is born of his expertise in nature poetry and his concern about global warming and other environmental woes. At a time when many of his cohort were making retirement plans, John became involved with a new sustainability minor in the College of Science and has embraced cross-college teaching. He reads voraciously, not only in literature, but also in science. This praise was echoed by colleagues in biology and chemistry, who noted that he brings visionary and sometimes prophetic literary readings into dialogue with writings of policymakers and scientists. Favorite classes include Garden to Ecosystem, Literature and Ecology, and the Introduction to the Sustainability minor. The Sustainability minor draws students from across all colleges, and so it can be difficult to teach. Yet, according to one of his fellow teachers, and I quote, "What stood out was John's reaching out and connection with students. I believe, and in many times I actually felt, that he was able to connect with the students in a heartfelt manner, and they responded in kind." Indeed, student testimonials that I read for preparing this little introduction were quite fun to read because they included lines like this one from a biology major. "I began the class with a negative outlook on the study of literature, particularly poetry," and also included this one, "Professor Sitter opened my mind to the power of literature." Other students praised his creativity and the supportive classroom atmosphere that makes it easy for students to get enthusiastic about the topic, regardless of their major. Another noted that his intelligence and wit shine through every class, and he often had the class chuckling. She noted that it was difficult, but rewarding and enjoyable. Let me close then by recalling that dearest freshness that nature bestows on us, living creatures, in Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, God's Grandeur. I believe it is John's sympathy for all of us deep down things that brings out the bright wings of his academic excellence, and we are all the better for it. So please join me in welcoming to the podium the winner of the 2014 Charles E. Sheedy Award for Excellence in Teaching.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you so much for coming. I suddenly understand, looking out in this room full of talented and dedicated teachers, what people mean when they say getting a certain award is very humbling. It is indeed. It's also very gratifying. Thank you. Thanks to so many of my colleagues in English and in the college and beyond, as I'll say in a moment. Thanks first to Valerie Sayers, former chair of my department, not only for her nomination and support for this award, but for making it possible, and to Dean John McGreevy for making it possible for me to teach one of my annual courses in the sustainability minor for 3 of the last 4 years, and to the Sheedy Award Committee for recognizing the relevance of work partly outside this college. I want to thank 2 colleagues from the College of Science who are chiefly responsible for building the sustainability minor and with whom I've had the privilege of collaborating over the last 4 years, Jessica Hellman of biology and Tony Seriani of chemistry. They've done a great service to all of us and to our undergraduates for getting that program off the ground. And I've learned much by being able to collaborate with them. I want to thank some colleagues, too, within this college that I've been able to collaborate with. Andy Weigert of Sociology and Celia Dean Drummond of Theology. And while I'm thanking, I thank my wife, Kate, who's never dissuaded me from taking on new teaching, even though it has inevitably meant listening to even more fretting about being underprepared. And to my son, Ben, from whom I've learned more than he knows and who's traveled here from Pittsburgh to be with us, giving up many billable hours to do so. It seems much more than a decade since we moved to Notre Dame. Emory University, where I had taught for more than 2 decades, is like Notre Dame in many ways in its academic achievements and aspirations, but there are a few differences. I'll limit myself to 2. Emory is a largely non-religious university without a football team. Notre Dame is a university where football was a religion, and religion is a contact sport. Okay. When Valerie Sayers and Jim Brockmole, the acting undergraduate dean, came together in my office last spring to tell me I'd won this award, I eloquently blurted out, "I'm speechless." Without missing a beat, Jim said, "Not for long," referring to this event. I thought "not for long" was pretty funny the first time I heard it. Then I began to hear that phrase again and again whenever I asked colleagues how I should address the faculty. So, in any event, as I understand this occasion, I've been invited to speak for about 25 minutes. You've been invited to listen. And to quote Adlai Stevenson, I very much hope we will end at the same time. Were this talk to be about my pedagogical theory, it would conclude a few seconds from now. All I have to say theoretically is that good college teaching rests on being genuinely interested in one's subject and on being genuinely interested in the intellectual growth of young adults. Knowing nothing more than that, I'll not presume to speak to all of you about how to teach. Instead, I will use this opportunity to reflect on some of what we teach and some of what we might teach as we move into the future. So my subject generally will be teaching the future. But before giving up entirely on pedagogical advice, I do want to say one more thing about how to succeed in teaching. Have some great teachers. One of mine, the most influential of mine, Brother Jerry Molyneux, was my teacher in the 10th and 12th grades for English, Latin, and religion, and homeroom, an advisor to the school paper at LaSalle High School, a Christian Brothers school in Cumberland, Maryland. Without Brother Jerry's influence and inspiration, I simply would not be with you here today. It's deeply gratifying to have him with us and to reintroduce him to you today. Thank you, Brother Jerry. Brother Jerry was only a few years older than the Appalachian ruffians he was sent to subdue, and I realize in retrospect he was already plotting his escape to a more genteel livelihood. During the summers, he was completing a master's degree here at Notre Dame and would soon go on to the University of Wisconsin to earn a PhD in film studies. And since then, he's spent a rich career at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, publishing books on Charlie Chaplin, Jimmy Stewart, Gregory Peck, and John Sayles. It was Brother Jerry who taught us, among so many other things, who taught us that an essay submitted in black ink could come back bearing more red ink, much of it forming words like vague, verbose, cliched, stilted, awk, short for awkward, arg for arg, and sometimes simply good grief. I'm relieved now to see that he's not taking notes in red. But what I want to talk about is how should we be thinking about liberal education in the Anthropocene Academy? How might, or perhaps should, we study in the humanities change as we understand more fully that our species is now a major planetary force, that environmentally speaking, the traditional distinction between humanity and nature is growing indistinct. I'll come back to that division in a moment. About liberal arts, more broadly, I think of that the two fundamental goals of liberal education are to help students become better able to tell the truth and better equipped for their long-term future, educated, as we like to say, for life. The implications of both those phrases, to tell the truth and for life, are changing as our consciousness of living in the Anthropocene era deepens. When more and more professors recognize that human culture is now one of the great planetary forces of nature, we need to re-articulate our liberal arts missions. To tell the truth relates to educational goals in at least three senses of that verb. First is telling as discerning, as recognizing and discriminating features of reality through the ways that comprise the various disciplines of the liberal arts. The second sense is telling as communicating. Liberal arts education should increase students' capacity for revealing what they think to others through writing and speaking ever more effectively. The third sense of tell, now somewhat archaic but worth recalling, means to count, to number, to reckon. This sense points to the importance of quantitative reasoning and methods in the enterprise of finding and relating truth. Finally, perhaps we can go just a little further and think of tell as counting in yet another sense, to matter or to count for something. We want our students to be able not only to find the truth, but to find the truth telling. For the human sciences, or the sciences of meaning, I speak of the humanities because they're my academic home, but I use the term broadly to include all of us in this college whose studies center on human being and making. Perhaps we need a term like the human sciences. Sometimes when the humanities are distinguished from the sciences we usually call the sciences, the fact-value split is given more credence than it merits. Thus we can find ourselves saying, or letting others say, something like, the sciences have the facts, but we humanists have the values. This is too crude. Not only do scientists have values, some of my best friends are scientists, but science is, of course, conducted according to values, and humanists, of course, really do value facts. But this opposition of facts and values misleads in a more subtle way because it leaves out a crucial middle term, meaning. I will speak then of the humanities in the broad sense as the sciences of meaning. Putting the emphasis on the study of meaning reminds us, I think, of how enterprises ranging from an introductory language course or English composition share a foundation with studying analytic philosophy, historiography, or critical hermeneutics. It reminds us that the appetite for finding meaning in our lives is merely broader than, not distinct from, the drive to find meaning in cultural artifacts, in text, or in social institutions. From ethics to hermeneutics, the interpretive urge to get it right, to understand through intellectual rigor and imaginative projection, and to appreciate the other, these things connect our studies. One of the reasons, no doubt, why the humanities have thus far fared well at Notre Dame and many other Catholic universities flows from the Church's rich tradition of sophisticated and cosmopolitan hermeneutics, a tradition suspicious of fundamentalism and literalism. Humanists are concerned with actions, not simply events, actions being related to intentions, even when the actions are, we might say, overdetermined, or the intentions, we might say, unconscious. Events happen, but people perform actions. It's the humanities' concern with actions over events that might make us feel the inadequacy of the definition of history given by the character Ray, played by Colin Farrell in the film In Bruges. When his older partner Ken asks why he has no interest at all in exploring their historic surroundings, Ray says, "I used to hate history, didn't you? It's all just a load of stuff that's already happened." With the centrality of intention to the humanities in mind, we might distinguish actions from stuff that's happened, or events. I include in the humanities, as suggested a moment ago, all our colleagues in the social sciences interested, at least part of the time, in intentional action and in introspection and empathetic identification as possible ways of knowing. So here, I want simply to stress the inescapable ethical and interpersonal dimensions of humanistic inquiry, before going on to suggest that the humanities are also changing somewhat in ways we are just beginning to feel. So this next little section is about blurring of the found world and the made world in our Anthropocene era. The awarenesses of our contemporary moment have complicated one self-construct of the humanities, probably permanently. The traditional idea, older than Vico, that the natural sciences study the found world and the humanities the made world, the world of artifacts and institutions, rests on a division that has become blurred in this era. That is, this Anthropocene stage in which human activity is now seen as significantly shaping the hitherto non-human world. Some would date the beginning of the Anthropocene era thousands of years ago with the rise of agriculture, but more common dating is with the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century. That is the baseline often used in discussions of the rise of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide in particular in the atmosphere, which has risen from a level of about 280 parts per million to a little over 400 parts per million today. Others might put the really significant beginning of the Anthropocene within the last 6 or 7 decades, the period from about 1950 on that is often called the Great Acceleration, and in which most of that increase in CO2 levels has occurred, and virtually all the other increases in those hockey stick-shaped graphs. Human population and human economic activity especially have increased in that era. Human population, which had not reached 1 billion until about 1820, was a little over 2 billion at the end of World War II. Members of my generation may be the first to see the world's population quadruple in their lifetimes, at least the first generation to do so since the family of Noah. Our current population of 7.2 billion is often projected to rise to a little over 9 billion by later this century and then to level off. But a recent article in Science magazine argues persuasively that population growth is unlikely to stabilize in this century without unprecedented decreases in fertility rates, thus making very likely a population of between 11 and 12 billion by the end of the century. In any event, at current rates, each day the Earth gains about 200,000 people and loses about 35,000 acres of forest. If, like me, you need images to go with numbers, imagine Notre Dame Stadium filled, then filled again, then filled half, 2.5 times altogether, and you have about 200,000 people. Next, imagine all of our campus. It's 1,250 acres from the softball fields to beyond the lakes. And now try to multiply that image 28 times, and we get the rough area of forest to disappear by 4 o'clock tomorrow. Now, how these facts, human population and environmental impacts, relate to each other would make an ideal question with which to begin a set of general education courses. The significance of these numbers, their connections and their relations to the extinctions of plants and animals, to mean temperatures, to ocean acidification, raise issues that are complex, no doubt disputed, pregnant with ethical problems, and richly historical, in short, issues that are academic in the highest sense. So, academic responsibility in the Anthropocene. The awareness of human impacts on global systems necessarily changes much in how we think about ourselves as humans in relation to the rest of creation. And it complicates common sense ideas of responsibility, even as such thoughts tend to be repressed in our daily routines. Charles Dudley Warner's remark that everybody talks about the weather but nobody does anything about it could be restated in our time. Nobody talks about the climate, but everybody does something about it. Now, nobody is an overstatement, of course. Hundreds of articles, books, white papers, international reports, and so on have appeared over the last 2 decades. The question, I think, is how should all this knowledge be making more of a difference in our teaching? I came to study and teach literature out of a love of linguistic beauty and historical curiosity about the changing climates in which it was produced. Climates in that metaphorical way we tended until recently to use the word. I would rather not talk about literal climate change or other problems contributing to and flowing from it. But in these critical decades, the humanities must help us think not only about the achievements of individuals, but about humanity collectively in the world. I said that my subject was teaching the future. Teaching is always about the future, of course, even for those of us who do a lot of commuting to and from the past. But increasingly, it seems to me that teaching the future must include talking thoughtfully with our students about climate change and other unprecedented environmental crises that will affect their lives. And that if we professors do not do so, we risk creating an alternative university, building an educational theme park rather than a great university. The first part of Notre Dame's threefold aspiration, you'll recognize the language, to offer an unsurpassed undergraduate education. In one sense, in that formulation, unsurpassed means as good as or better than any other college or university. But we must also want it to mean not surpassed by reality. 5 years ago, shortly after the financial crisis of 2008, Harvard President Drew Gilpin Faust wrote a piece in the New York Times about the crisis of the universities, and I'm quoting here for this paragraph. At this moment in our history, universities might well ask if they have in fact done enough to raise the deep and unsettling questions necessary to any society. As the world indulged in a bubble of false prosperity and excessive materialism, should universities, in their research, teaching, and writing, have made greater efforts to expose the patterns of risk and denial? Should universities have presented a firmer counterweight to economic irresponsibility? Have universities become too captive to the immediate and worldly purposes they serve? Has the market model become the fundamental and defining identity of higher education? The question that President Faust raised remain and should be extended, I think, into an ecological register. Should universities make greater efforts to expose the patterns of ecological risk and denial? Should universities present a firmer counterweight to environmental irresponsibility? Has the model of growth and productivity become the fundamental and defining identity of higher education? So toward imagining the Anthropocene Academy, astrophysicist Brian Schmidt, 2011 Nobel laureate, said recently that we are poised to do more damage to the Earth in the next 35 years. You see what I mean about the support? Thank you. Schmidt said, we are poised to do more damage to the Earth in the next 35 years than we've done in the last 1,000. We can readily imagine that this university, 35 years from now, which will include many of you who are in the early stages of your careers, will be quite different. But we have more trouble, of course, imagining just how it will differ. As another physicist, Niels Bohr, said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. Still, it is hard not to wonder what sort of mid-century environment will face the students, the faculty, administration, president of Notre Dame, whoever he or she might be. We need not try to project the future in detail to recognize some necessary first steps in rethinking our pedagogical contract with the young. Much has been written in recent years about the growing burden of financial debt as students borrow larger amounts to pay for their educations, but too little discussion is heard about the ecological debt they face. How do we bring this overdue conversation to the center of the academy? We can begin with one of the most widely shared liberal arts goals, typically expressed in college mission statements, to educate civic leaders. We will need a more ecologically conceived globalism, as well as a more deeply planetary sense of responsible citizenship, to move ahead. The ultimate aim of a Notre Dame education, in the genuinely fine language of our mission statement, is to create a sense of human solidarity and concern for the common good that will bear fruit as learning becomes service to justice. In the Anthropocene Academy, we need to think of the common good as planetary as well as communitarian, and learning in the service of justice must include intergenerational justice, lest it eventually mean little more than preparing students for law schools. Now, responsibly drawing the connections between carbon emissions and teaching missions does not mean abandoning what we've been teaching in the liberal arts. It's not only more feasible, but in most cases more intellectually sound to reinterpret some of our aims and offerings than to replace them. If the customary separation of natural sciences from humanities and social sciences has become intellectually untenable in the Anthropocene era, then thinking broadly about anthropogenesis points toward the need for more ecologically inflected humanities and social science courses of many kinds, and for more science courses designed around ethical problems and policy challenges. The point, I think, would not be to turn every course into environmental X or Y and climate change, but to incorporate environmental awareness into a significant range of existing courses. Some ambitious integrations of environmental science and humanities and social science courses are taking place all over the country, but to make these practices more common and more rigorous requires enabling large numbers of faculty members to learn about each other's subjects. This is an ideal time for more team teaching and course development by scientists and non-scientists. Such collaboration can be valuable under nearly any circumstances, but it will be most rewarding if complemented by internally sponsored study leaves and reduced teaching assignments to allow participation in rigorous faculty seminars, ideally populated by roughly equal numbers of natural scientists, social scientists, and humanists. Now let me pause here to acknowledge that I've just proposed something that will cost money, and to stress that we're very fortunate to have an enlightened provost and dean who will surely see the value of such an investment. The point of something like internally funded study leaves is to recognize that some learning projects, for example, learning the basics of a new discipline, may be vital to our educational mission, but would have no realistic chance of competing in the usual disciplinary world of external grants. Now, in these last 3 or 4 minutes, I offer a few thoughts about academic responsibility in the Anthropocene Academy. Pardon me, I just skipped a page. If we're to talk differently to students, we need to talk differently among ourselves. For we tend often to say one set of truths to each other professionally in our fields, for example, reading and perhaps writing articles about unparalleled crises, and rehearse others on campus where business as usual legitimation and instruction will still often dominate committee and department meetings. But we can't afford to maintain two worlds, one for what we know and one for what we do. Teachers who think steadily about environmental matters tend to feel mystified by the general absence of urgency around them. The lack of urgency can be partly attributed to institutional inertia, routinized busyness, academic careerism, and so on, but it has an intellectual cause as well. We worry quite properly about turning instruction into advocacy. And some rationales for the liberal arts directly oppose the academic, the properly academic, to the urgent. This tendency is epitomized by Stanley Fish's book of a few years ago, Save the World on Your Own Time, where Fish contends that the proper way to, quote, academicize a topic is to detach it from the context of its real-world urgency. There's a point there But the academic formalism and professional complacency underlying this habit of mine are no longer tenable. What needs saving is not the world in some extrinsic sense, and it's not the planet, which would do fine without us, but the human civilizations and traditions that we teach and in which our intellectual values have arisen, including values of the university as an institution and higher education itself. Saving the world academically means saving civilization as we teach it. In a time of global environmental emergency, the liberal arts must provide education for citizenship on a planetary scale or slowly become a set of museum exhibits. We know we've entered a new educational era when a noted environmental philosopher, Holmes Rolston, counsels us to become wiser than Socrates. And another, Dale Jameson, wonders whether morality has more than met its match in the Anthropocene. Rolston means that contemporary ethics needs to include environmental as well as interpersonal relations. And Jameson means that the traditional moral principles fitted for a world of proximate relations may not be enough to guide us as global citizens. This moment challenges us to ground our educational ideals anew and ultimately with more honesty. Jameson's most recent account, Reason in a Dark Time, concludes that we're approaching a world that increasingly fails to resemble the one in which we came to consciousness. In this new world, the biota will change, diversity will diminish, weather will be less stable, skies will be different, and it will become increasingly difficult to relate to the old stories and tales. Difficult, not impossible. This rupture with the past brings the Anthropocene Academy's mission into focus, I think. Global changes affecting plants, animals, biodiversity, climate, atmosphere, cultural traditions, narratives, and interpretations. Here are the materials for a profoundly interdisciplinary learning and teaching. A newly rationalized and energized liberal arts education can be one in which we and our students get ever better at telling the truth. My fellow teachers, for your intellectual hospitality, thoughtful companionship, and today, your patience, thank you very much.